Do people still watch 60 Minutes? The story they did recently on horse racing doesn't tell the whole story. It wasn't just FBI wiretaps that exposed and moved the industry. It's also been PETA activism. What needs to be done now? Next on the PETA Podcast. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil, Guillermo, your host for this inside look at animal rights. Brought to you by PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. On today's episode, 60 Minutes' big story on horse racing used PETA video to show the horrible abuse at America's racetracks. But the report, while featuring sexy wiretap evidence and jailed culprits, didn't tell the whole story, like how PETA's Equine Matters department has worked hard to expose the animal cruelty, the use of drugs and horse deaths in racing, to the point where the industry is now trying desperately to save itself. PETA Sr.VP Guillermo reviews the report and outlines the real solutions that the industry has resisted, but could end animal cruelty now. On this edition of the PETA Podcast. So 60 Minutes does a big report on all the things that PETA has been working on in terms of trying to reform horse racing. How did it do?
Pretty well. I thought they covered some of the key issues. Number one being the doping of horses, of the illegal drugging of horses, and the other being the deaths. And the producers had been in touch with us before it aired to gather video footage. That devastating, catastrophic injury of Lost in Limbo was video taken by our investigator at Churchill Downs. So we had some idea of what they were going to cover. And I thought overall it was a very good segment.
But they didn't include the PETA watermark on the video. They didn't mention animal rights activists like PETA being at the forefront of this issue. It made it sound like, hey, here's this group now that can go out, HISA, which is the horse racing board that was established by Congress. And it made it sound like, oh, here now they're going to do it. And now, oh, the FBI was involved and here's an investigation. And made it sound like, oh, there's so much done already. What did you think about that portrayal?
I've become so used to that, people using our video footage without giving us credit, although I assume there was a credit in the end credits of the program, that, what can I say? It's most important that the information get out there. But I'm really proud that we laid the foundation for much of the work that they covered. The legislation, for example, that led to the Horse Racing and Integrity and Safety Authority, which is now trying to get a handle on this drugging issue in racing. That legislation finally got off the ground after our 2014 investigation of trainer Steve Asmussen, which was released by the New York Times. And it was incredibly gratifying right after that investigation was released to hear Ogden Phipps, who was then the chairman of the Jockey Club, state publicly he was horrified by what our investigation showed, which was the gratuitous use of medications to keep injured horses running, and that the Jockey Club would back federal legislation. And they were good for their word. Legislation was then introduced. It took several years to pass, and it led to what we have now, which is what's called HISA, the authority that's trying to get a handle on this.
And if PETA had not done that investigation in 2014 that the New York Times picked up, do you think we would have gotten a HISA?
Perhaps eventually, but I really think that until we put this issue on the public map, and when I say public, I mean not just people in racing who had known for many years there were problems, and some of whom had worked to get legislation introduced, it might not have been as broad an issue as it was. We have a large group of supporters and some attention in the public. And making it an issue of concern to all Americans and not just people in racing, I think really laid the foundation for that bill.
So the 60 Minutes report concentrated talking to the new leader at HISA. They haven't done anything yet. And so the real focus of the report in terms of getting stuff done was talking about the FBI investigation, and the sexy part were the wiretaps that showed one of the Kentucky Derby trainers negotiating for some kind of drugging, and in fact, he and one of his associates were jailed. So that made it sound like, boy, something's happening. But put that in perspective, put that into context. What does it represent really?
The FBI investigation was just an incredible step forward in trying to police this industry. There's so much more work that needs to be done, but it was important because those audio tapes that were played on 60 Minutes show just how ruthless some of these people in horse racing are. There was no concern about the horses whatsoever. It was, give me the drugs. I'm going to inject it. I believe it was one of the trainers was saying, I'm going to inject my horse, or I did inject my horse 50 times before a major race. And the way that they keep one step ahead of the regulators, because there aren't tests for new illegal substances that have been developed, or they change a molecule on a substance, and that means there's no test for it. So I thought that was really key, because then the millions of viewers of 60 Minutes could see this is the way some people in racing think, and it's the way they've operated. What I'm proud of about PETA's role in this is that the man who was behind this investigation, Jeff Corral, the owner of Meadowlands Harness Racing Track in New Jersey, was somebody that I met with in 2012, more than 10 years ago. And I went to him and said, drugs and whipping, your harness tracks, drugs and whipping, you need to get a handle on this. And to my shock, he agreed. And he put out a news release saying, first, we're going to deal with the whipping, and then we're going to take on the drugs. And he's been good for his word. He kicks people off his tracks when he finds they have violated drug regulations. And, these trainers house their horses at the track, at the stables, at the track. And he makes them all sign a statement saying that they understand they may be randomly drug tested, and that if they're found to have an illegal substance, they will be booted off his track. And then the agency that he hired to conduct some of his investigations provided the initial evidence to the FBI that led to the indictments and conviction of these 27 veterinarians and trainers.
And so we saw, and this is where it could be confusing somewhat, because Corral does harness tracks, and some of the information, in fact, the big piece of tape, audio tape they played involved a thoroughbred trainer. How are they similar or dissimilar?
Very different kinds of racing. The harness tracks are pretty much as it sounds. These are horses who are pulling what's called a sulky, a very light carriage, very small, light carriage around a track. And the horses trot. They don't gallop or run. And then the thoroughbred, those are standardbred horses. So the thoroughbred racing is what we see when we turn on the TV on Kentucky Derby Day. Those are horses with jockeys on their backs. What they have in common, apparently, is their desire to win at any cost, even at the cost of the horse's safety, health, and lives.
So the trainer that was involved here, his name again?
Well, there were a number of them, but the two profiled were Jason Service, who was the trainer of Maximum Security, a horse who won the Kentucky Derby, was later disqualified for the way that the horse ran in front of another horse, and Jorge Navarro. Those were the two profiled who were having the discussion about, wow, this is great stuff, but we have to keep it really secret.
And they were also convicted, and they are serving out some jail time.
That's correct.
And so it looks like, we got them, right? I mean, but they're barely scratching the surface, really, right?
I'm afraid that's probably the case, and the one issue that I would take with the segment on 60 Minutes is that it talked about the illegal drugs. So much of what PETA has focused on has been the misuse of legal medications the painkillers, the anti-inflammatories, the sedatives that are used legally, but that endanger the horses' lives because it keeps them running when they should be recuperating from injury.
Just the term doping, when it's used in the story, it makes it sound like, oh, they're juicing up the horses. And they even used the term juice. It makes it sound like, oh, all they're doing is pumping these horses with drugs. They make them go faster, and that's the problem. That's the issue. But that's really just part of it.
That's part of it. And there was a very effective scene, I thought, in the segment where they showed these shoes of trainer Jorge Navarro that said Juice Man on them, and that he was an open secret in the racing industry for his use of illegal substances to keep horses going. But yes, there are so many medications that are legal. And on the one hand, you have to say, well, if a horse is injured, the horse needs medication. Yep. But if that horse needs medication, that horse shouldn't be racing. And that's what we have focused so much attention on and have made some real progress in California, not so much in other places yet.
And that's a key thing to understand, the difference between doping with illegal drugs and the use of these drugs to make horses not feel the pain, but race instead. Because when you look at when the public really grasped this story, it's when they kept seeing the deaths mount, and deaths mount because horses get injured. They get injured because they're racing when they shouldn't be.
That's right. And I think that's also why the video is so important. It's not an abstract thing when the horse dies on a racetrack. The horses fracture their bones. Sometimes in the video that we have captured, most recently at Saratoga, you'll see a horse with a broken leg. The leg snaps on the track, and the end of that leg is just flapping. It is horrifying. And I think it's really important for people to know this is not this abstract thing. A horse is injured. This is a devastating, fatal injury that I just have to think of every horse as the individual that animal is. This is an individual. This is that individual's one life. And it's this animal's being basically raced to death.
And it's also interesting to note that this is pretty standard in horse racing, and only when PETA began to expose the deaths and the number of deaths, people began to take notice, because it used to be just such a common occurrence that when a horse died, it wasn't like if, in another sport, if an athlete died, like a baseball player died, everyone pays attention, or a football player. But here in horse racing, when a horse died, it was like, well, we'll cart him off in an ambulance, and because the fracture can't be repaired, we'll euthanize the horse, and the horse dies. I mean, that really was the way it was treated until PETA made people pay attention.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of reasons for that. You're right. It was collateral damage. The death of a horse was the collateral damage of horse racing. But I think there were a few reasons that people were not affected by it. One is that most people don't care about horse racing. Most people don't go to the racetrack. They might watch racing once or twice a year on network sports television, and that is about it. That's one reason. And the other, I think, is the public's evolving attitude toward animals and how they're used in entertainment. Because these deaths were occurring at around the same time that PETA was protesting the use of animals in circuses, and Ringling Brothers specifically. And there was a long Ringling Brothers campaign by PETA, more than 10 years, where we exposed the abuse of these animals and the miserable lives they led. And now that circus is closed down. And that is a reflection of how the public is saying, this is entertainment. We really don't need to see animals suffer for entertainment.
The 60 Minutes piece, when you saw it, you saw maybe 10, 15 years of your activism sort of come to a head, but there's so much more that wasn't told.
And there's so much more that can be done to help horses. And we keep banging this drum to every track. I mean, ultimately, the only way that you're going to prevent the suffering of horses in racing is not to have racing anymore. But that doesn't absolve the people in racing right now of their failure to do everything that they can possibly do to protect these horses and prevent their deaths.
Among your duties at PETA is to head up the department Equine Matters, and you have 12 simple rules that could be implemented that could stop horses from dying and stop the abuse at racetracks now. What are those 12?
Well, let me just preface this by saying that these are not in a particular order of importance, but these are 12 simple actions that could make a huge difference for horses. It's not everything that could be done, but it is a start. And this is what we have repeatedly said to tracks they need to do. So the first thing is to ban all medications for 2 weeks before a race. And this is so that the horses, to the greatest extent possible, are no longer feeling the effects of the painkillers, the muscle relaxants, the anti-inflammatories. And if they're sore, they're going to show that they're sore. So just get rid of the medications in the 2 weeks before a race. If they need medication, then they shouldn't be racing.
And 2 weeks, arbitrary, or why 2 weeks?
Well, for safety, really. Many of these drugs take, 2 or 3 days or even longer to get out of the horse's system. But we have to remember that except for that day or two before a race, these horses may be having multiple medications injected into them. So it's a reasonable period of time for somebody still to plan when an animal's going to race, when that horse is going to be on the track, but to get all those drugs out of his system.
All right. So number 2 is allow horses who are injured or sore sufficient time to recuperate before they're trained or raced. That seems so obvious, but that doesn't happen.
It doesn't happen because these animals are, as one veterinarian put it, they're chemical horses. Because the way of dealing with soreness is not to allow an animal to recuperate, but to inject that animal with a drug to make the pain go away.
Also, these animals are, either they're money pits for the owner or they're cash machines. And the horse doesn't make any money if it's not on the track.
I think that's how some people look at it, unfortunately. And I also think we just have people who may have spent their whole lives dealing with horses on the track, but who really, frankly, aren't very good horsemen.
All right.
And that's the term used in the racing industry. They call them horsemen, but they got to be good or the animals suffer.
Now, number 3 is install cutting edge CT scan equipment at all tracks. I think it would come as a surprise that isn't a thing that is happening now, and that it is a thing that PETA has been raising for years, but has been relatively ignored.
They would have you believe that they do have cutting edge imaging equipment on the tracks. And I think this is important to explain the difference. First of all, I believe this is the most important step that could be taken to protect horses. There are some tracks that do have imaging equipment. They have PET scans and they have MRIs. Both of those are inadequate for what we're talking about. Neither of them can be used as something that can be done to screen horses. They only are used diagnostically. So in other words, a horse is sore or appears to be sore, or there's a suspicion of an injury. They could do an MRI, they could do a PET scan if it's the horse's ankle only, and then that would diagnose the problem. I'm talking about a piece of equipment that is low radiation that could screen every single horse who's on that track before they get anywhere near that track. And this was something that was developed by a company called CurveBeam, which does imaging equipment for humans and does in fact have this kind of CT scan equipment that is in use for human athletes right now. And this would provide, in just a few minutes, without anesthesia, would provide a 3-dimensional scan of the horse's legs. It would take perhaps 7 or 8 minutes. Horse stands there quietly, at the most might need a sedative. And then once the initial study is done to populate the artificial intelligence of the software, it will just spit out the report. You don't even have to have a veterinarian standing there reading the scans, which would be impossible for 100 horses in a day otherwise. And this will show, is there micro damage in the bones? Is there a fracture that hasn't been detected? To me, this is the most important thing that they could do on a racetrack to spare horses.
What it sounds like you're describing is sort of like the final gatekeeper before a horse goes on the track. You go through this CAT scan and you can find if the horse is well enough to run.
Yes, and I have a suspicion that part of the reason that this has been rejected so far is that they may not want to know this information. Already, the number of horses in each race has decreased significantly across the country because they are being more careful with what they can do because they don't want horses dying. It looks so bad. But this would be kind of the final arbiter. And let me tell you, I have met with so many organizations, the Jockey Club, the Jockeys Club Research Foundation, Churchill Downs Incorporated, Del Mar, the Stronach Group, owners of Santa Anita Park. I have met with so many in the industry trying to promote this imaging equipment. And they all have some reason or another that they don't want to do it. And the next thing I know, look, we have a PET scan at our track. It's just window dressing.
So this would be really the answer, but people don't want to get to the answer. They'll come up with these things that, might get to the answer, but still allows for that wiggle room that I don't want to say it will enable the dopers and the people who are trying to skirt around the rules, but it does protect people who operate in a certain way to continue operating the same way. Otherwise, a CAT scan would say, sorry, your horse is infirm and can't run.
Well said, because if they had a little bit of vision, if they could think about it, they would also find out how often they could exercise horses without injuring them. They could theoretically keep a horse safe from the moment that horse is old enough to be on a track throughout that horse's whole racing life. By this, they could protect the horses and therefore protect their own investment if you're going to think of horses as commodities. But they're afraid of it is the only conclusion that I can reach.
And if we are going to turn to HISA, which is the new authority overseeing racing, what kind of reaction have they given to CAT scan equipment like curve beams?
I think that HISA, or the Horse Racing Integrity and Safety Authority, is really just getting started. At least I hope that is the case. I don't yet know how they feel about the imaging equipment. The jury is out on how effective they will be. I'm hopeful because I think they present a way that we could crack down on some of these trainers who are breaking the rules. How they think that imaging equipment will fit into this and many of the other 12 items that we're going through, I don't yet know. We will wait and see.
But if the imaging equipment were used, they'd be able to see and find out just how many horses were infirm and couldn't and shouldn't run. What kind of an impact would that have on the number of scratches and the really low number of horses that are racing now? Would it expose racing totally?
I can't say without seeing all those scans, but that's my suspicion. That is my suspicion. And I think it's also important to note that one thing that the racing industry's own research has shown, which the listeners of our podcast know well, is that more than 90% of these horses who do suffer a catastrophic, fatal broken bone have an injury at the site of that break that had gone undetected.
So you're right. CAT scan imaging equipment should be right up there. To the degree that it's not being pushed by the industry says a lot about the industry's willingness to police itself.
That's right.
Well, let's go to number 4. Replace dirt tracks with high-quality synthetic taffeta. That's been done before. Is it helpful?
Yeah, PETA is how they say that. And it has been done and is being done on some tracks now. One thing we know from, again, the industry's own statistics is that if you look at the number of horses who suffer fatal injuries on tracks, and there are 3 surfaces that are available now: the dirt, which is what most people are familiar with, what they call the turf, which is grass, and then a synthetic. track. And that's what PETA is. Every single year, the data comes back the same. There are the fewest deaths on the synthetic track.
And
so I think if you know you're going to have fewer deaths, you need to get rid of the tracks where there are more deaths. This is just so obvious to me. And if you look at Keeneland a number of years ago, Keeneland Racetrack in Kentucky installed a synthetic track. The number of deaths went down, but some of the people in racing, the owners and the trainers, didn't like the synthetic. And so they took out the synthetic and put the dirt track back in, and then the number of deaths went up. And if that doesn't say everything you need to know about the racing industry, nothing else will.
What was the reason, though, for wanting the dirt track? Did the horses, clearly more horses died. They don't necessarily run better, but was it a training method thing? Why would they want a dirt track?
It's so funny. I've heard people say, well, fewer horses die, but more horses are injured. But I've never seen any statistics to back up that claim. And I've heard people say, I just don't like it. We don't like it. I don't like it. And Keeneland, which was vying to bring the Breeders' Cup World Championship races to Kentucky, is my understanding, got rid of the synthetic track and put the dirt track back in because the Breeders' Cup said they wouldn't come to Keeneland unless they did. Now, I can't point to an article that says that, but that is what insiders tell us.
All right. Number 5, ban trainers who have multiple medication infractions or harm horses in other ways. Well, if you did that, you wouldn't have many trainers, would you?
This is how I look at it. If you're a trainer and right now you're risking the life of a horse because you know that all you're going to get is a $500 fine, if that, then why not risk the horse? In your desire to get the prize money or to get whatever you can out of racing, they're willing to risk the horse. If a trainer knows, on the other hand, look, if I take a horse I'm not too sure about, who's perhaps has had a little lameness in the last few months, and that horse has a fatal injury on the track, and I'm going to be suspended while that's investigated and lose my livelihood, I'm going to be real darn careful about what horse I put on the track.
Now, when you say ban trainers, is that a lifetime ban? Because there was a story at the Breeders' Cup where there was a trainer who was suspended 10 years, was allowed to come back.
Right. Well, and we are talking about two different things, too, because when I say ban trainers who have multiple violations, I'm talking also about trainers who have drugging violations. You look at some of the trainers today, they have 20, 30, 40 medication violations, and yet they're still training. So there's that. I think they should be banned outright. That will convince them not to misuse the drugs and get the violations. And then if the other issue that I'm talking about is suspension of license when a horse dies.
Number 6 is ban whipping. That's been done in some tracks, hasn't it?
It's been done in some countries, not in this one, but we have seen some really serious reform that was undone by the passage of the Horse Racing Integrity and Safety Act, unfortunately. New Jersey banned whipping entirely. And then when HISA came in, they wanted to make the whipping rules uniform. And so they forced the states who had strong whipping rules to lower their standards and come back down to what they recommended. This was really unfortunate, I thought, because as I said, New Jersey banned whipping and California had a very strong whip rule, and they weren't happy about changing that. On the other hand, you look at some states like Louisiana and Texas and West Virginia and Ohio that had really essentially no regulation involving the whipping of a horse, and that's been improved. But I think the days of discussing how many times I should be allowed to hit the horse need to be behind us. We need to stop beating horses. That's just so obvious to me. They keep telling us these horses love to run. Well, if they love to run, then why are you punishing them to make them do it?
Well, it is the most visible sign of cruelty that people see, especially down the stretch. Here they come going to the finish line, and you see a jockey whipping and whipping and whipping. Is there a limit right now in terms of how many times you can go to the whip?
Yeah, there is a limit. It's a total of 5 strikes of the horse, and strikes is such a benign word. They're allowed to beat the horse 5 times, and they have to pause between each time they hit the horse to see if the horse responds. If you look at the scientific studies on whipping of racehorses, you will know that when you whip a horse, that's a punishment. So the belief that horses actually go faster when you whip them is belied by the research that shows that that isn't actually when the horses run their fastest. But it certainly does startle them and hurt them. And in fact, you see when you look at where horses break their bones on a track, it is nearly always in that final stretch after they have begun beating them that those bones break.
All right. So we talk about how fragile these horses are. And, when you see these whipping rules, I mean, they're beating horses who are 3, 4, 5-year-olds. The babies who are 2-year-olds, they get whipped too, but they are so young and still, they're not as formed. They're babies. Number 7 in your list is eliminate time sprints at 2-year-old in training auctions. Why is this an important thing?
Yeah, this is a little bit down in the horse racing weeds because I think most people are unaware that this is even going on. But there are auctions every year of the very young, the 2-year-old horses. And most thoroughbred horses begin racing at the age of 2. And at these auctions, they like to make the horses sprint for a short distance as fast as they can. And that drives up the sales price of these horses. If they go really fast, then people are saying, wow, that's a fast horse. The price goes up. What we found, and this is our most recent investigation of the horse racing industry on PETA.org, is that these horses, first of all, they have no idea what they're doing. They're essentially babies. Some of them aren't even 2 chronologically. They're 18 months or 20 months. And they are whipped into a frenzy. And some of them die. Some of them break bones when they're just 2 years old at an auction to drive up the sales price. So it's important that this be changed. There's no reason to run these horses this fast. And PETA has a proposal into the industry and how to deal with this. And it's something we are pushing very hard this year to make this happen finally, that they stop this.
Well, the motivation is clear. Your horse runs fast, you beat it. To make it run faster, you get more money. So you must have a lot of opposition to this.
Well, here's the irony of the whole thing. It does drive up the sales price, but how fast a 2-year-old runs at these auctions has no bearing on the success of these horses in their racing life. It is not a predictor of whether or not that horse will win later on.
But it pads the pockets of breeders who say, hey, here's a fast horse. So we'll follow that one. Number 8, be transparent. What do you mean by that?
Stop hiding the death statistics. Right now, we have just 2 states, California and New York, that have any transparency at all about when horses die and how they die. And both New York and California have websites where this information is published. Everybody needs to come clean about it. Everybody needs to be honest about how many horses are dying. If there's going to be any improvement in racing, there has to be accountability for what they're doing. So come clean. Every state needs to have a website where they publish this information.
Number 9 is don't sell horses to foreign racing entities that routinely send them to slaughter.
South Korea and Japan is where we have done investigations. And just to be clear, these horses aren't being sold to go to slaughter. They're being sold to the racing industry in Japan and the racing industry in South Korea. And we have focused most recently on South Korea, where we actually went into a horse slaughterhouse there. And we're working very hard on making improvements in South Korea. They had no retirement program. We're working on that, just as we did in Japan, which now has a semblance of a retirement program for racehorses. But Americans should not be selling horses to any country where they know that at the end of that horse's racing life, there's a one-way ticket to a slaughterhouse. And that's what happens. There's no retirement. There's no time in the pasture. There's no moving on to what they call a second career as a show jumper. They go to the slaughterhouse.
And that leads us to number 10, which is take care of horses when their racing days are over.
This seems so obvious, doesn't it? You have a horse who's being used for the profit that they will bring you, and yet so many of these horses end up at terrible auction houses. Thousands of them are sold to what are called kill buyers, put on trucks, shipped to Canada and Mexico, where the slaughter of horses for human consumption is legal, and their flesh is sold primarily overseas to European and Asian countries. We think, and I think everybody would agree with us, that an industry that profits from and uses horses has the obligation to make sure that the horses are taken care of for their entire lives. You know, it wasn't until 2012 that the racing industry, after meeting with us, even had a retirement program at all. And it's the Thoroughbred Aftercare Alliance. It's not perfect. They're underfunded. The racing industry needs to put more money into it. There's a lot more that could be done. But the fact that an animal rights group had to compel the racing industry to take care of some of their horses says a lot about the industry.
And then the final two, number 11 and 12 on your list, are kind of related. One is conduct mandatory, unannounced, frequent, and random out-of-competition testing. Is this the thing that is resisted the most? I mean, because it sounds kind of invasive.
Yeah, well, I think anybody who's going to race a horse at a track needs to sign an agreement that they will submit to this. And this is what Jeff Garral at Meadowlands Racetrack requires of the trainers who board horses with him or race horses on his track. And it can be done in a number of states now. But what this means is anytime somebody should be able to show up at the horse's stall on the track, at the horse's stable off the track. If the horse is en route from Kentucky to New York, that truck could be stopped. Blood and urine can be taken and it can be tested for drugs. And if they're not willing to submit to this, then you know something's wrong.
And if they were on their toes, knowing that looking over their shoulder, it would probably cut down the use of illegal drugs. One would think. It's logical.
And for those who don't take it seriously, they can get booted right out of racing, or they should be booted right out of racing.
So that, unannounced frequent random testing is to see if people are complying, but it's also intended to, catch people who are using, illegal and legal drugs. Number 12 is require that a central pharmacy at racetracks control medication use. I guess that way you can find out who is getting what and who's putting what in their horses.
And that's the goal. And the way it works right now is that private equine veterinarians can come on the track and they can see horses individually, or as we've seen in some cases, they don't even see them, but they just prescribe medication and they provide that medication. And if a trainer is not going to be honest about what that horse is getting, then it would never be known. The central pharmacy model is done in Hong Kong, which has a pretty good handle on these issues. And it would mean that anytime a veterinarian wanted to prescribe a medication, the medication would have to come from the central pharmacy on the track. And that means that, just as you say, there is a record of it. And horses who are getting, say a number of sedatives or muscle relaxants or anti-inflammatory drugs, the system could be set up that would provide an alert to the stewards who are concerned about the health of these horses. And they're going to say, this horse has had 5 shots of an anti-inflammatory in the last 8 days. What's going on? Let's take a special look and make sure this horse is okay.
This would be like the central pharmacy. People might say, look, I'd rather have my own doctor. Why have a central pharmacy? I'll bring in, and they bring in their own veterinarians. That's how they bypass this now, right?
Well, yes, and they would still have their own veterinarians. But of course, why do they want to make sure that their drugs come directly from the veterinarian? So there's no accountability. This is the same idea as, states need to say when horses die. These trainers who are dealing with horses who may be injured or who may be sore, they shouldn't have anything to hide here. And these veterinarians prescribing drugs should not have anything to hide.
So we just went through 12 of PETA's list, simple rule changes that could, if implemented at racetracks, could save horses, could stop abuse. How close are we to seeing any of this or part of this being implemented, either by HISA enforcing it on tracks or by tracks saying, yeah, we'll do that?
Yeah, it's a race right now between horse racing is going to be forced to end because so many horses are dying, and we're going to make changes to spare the horses. And we'll see who wins that race right now. But I can say there are a number of tracks that are putting in synthetic surfaces. They're not all mandating that. There are a number of states, most notably California and to some extent Kentucky and New York, that have implemented changes in drugging. There's discussion of central pharmacy in some tracks. So none of these things are foreign concepts, and they're all under discussion. Whether or not racing ends because of the deaths before any of them happen completely, we'll see.
And it's too bad that really not much of this, not much of the 12 was really part of that 60 Minutes expose.
And I understand that 60 Minutes can't cover everything. I get that. But what I hope people take away from that is death and drugs. Death and drugs. And that's what we're talking about with all 12 of these very simple suggestions that are a starting point for racetracks who want to change things.
So 60 Minutes, maybe if they would get more of the 12 if they called it 72 minutes.
that would be very good. And I think what is so key in this is for everyone involved in racing to understand that they have to put the horses first, not just say they're putting the horses first, and not pretend that because a horse is glossy and beautifully brushed and groomed and looks wonderful, that means they're putting the horses first. They really have to think about the fact that while horses die, their industry is going right down the tubes.
And what, again, is your hope that HISA is going to have an impact and do the right thing?
I would love for HISA to implement or require the implementation of everything that we've seen. And most importantly, right now, as they deal with these medication violations, there must be serious consequences for the trainers. These violations and paltry fines can't continue to be simply the cost of doing business.
And once again, your one thing, if it was implemented, could really cut down the deaths that we see at races.
CT scan, the use of the curved beam, CAT scan.
Kathy Guillermo, PETA Senior VP and head of the Equine Matters department at PETA, on the solutions that could help end animal abuse in racing, including the one most important thing, a CAT scan of horses on race day. Sounds simple enough, but PETA's been advocating for it for years, and the racing industry has resisted. For more information, go to PETA.org. And that's our show for today. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to send the link of this show to your friends. Tell them you like the PETA Podcast. You can contact us at PETA.org. You can find me on Twitter at Emil Amok. That's EMIL-AMOK. Or see my vlog at AMOK.com. Or see my work at ALDEF, the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund. That's ALDEF, AALDEF.org/blog. Or get this podcast on YouTube at Emil Amok 1. Once again, thank you for listening. Check out all our episodes on your favorite podcast app or on Apple Podcasts, where you can subscribe to as well as rate and review the show. It helps get the word out about the issues you care about. Our music is provided by Carbon Works. Check them out on YouTube. And join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.